Before, when we were dealing with activities, we had this beautiful system that Android gave us called intents, and this allowed us to communicate from one activity to another. Well, with fragments, we don't have that, and I hope that what we see with this next exercise, as we communicate from one fragment to another, you already have the skills with interfaces to make some really robust Java code work. So, now knowing that the activity lifecycle and fragment lifecycle are working together, and we know that a fragment has all these different steps that it goes through on its way to waiting for user interaction, let's see how we actually place those in an actual application. The application that we're using is going to be really simple. We see it a lot. It's the kind where you have a list of items and then a detail screen. Well, this is what it looks like on a tablet. We're going to go one over, and you see here that this fragment, fragment A, communicates with fragment B. This headlines fragment is this fragment right here. If you notice in our headlines fragment, we have all the things that we talked about with the life cycle. Let's go through them step by step and see where things happen. We start with the onAttach. I'm going to come back to this one, though, and talk about this in a minute. Then we also have onActivityCreated, onStart, and onListItemClick. This is not a normal fragment. This is actually a list fragment. The list fragment is basically the same thing as a fragment, but it has some boilerplate code for you that sets up a list view already. So, we have onActivityCreated. You can see that the setListAdapter method, which is, again, a simplified under-the-hood thing for us. If we were to actually follow this one down, you can see that this particular list fragment class actually just has some member variables to help us use a list view. It's things we would have to write for ourselves so often that it's easier for Android to give us a base class that has some of that stuff already implemented. So, we have that already set in a list adapter, looking just like an activity for a list view. We have an onListItemClick that's being overridden that actually sets a listener, again, under the list fragment hood, and allows us to call a method on a callback that will allow us to actually take what item is selected and pass it down to the activity. Now, you might wonder, okay, what are we doing with this activity? Why can't I talk to a fragment directly? Well, you don't know what the screen looks like. You don't really understand whether or not your code is being run in an environment A with 2 panes or environment B with 1 pane having to flip back and forth. The fragment shouldn't be concerned with that. And since it shouldn't be concerned with that, the way that we create functionality for cross-fragment communication is through interfaces and callbacks. Here I've created an interface. I call it onHeadlineSelectedListener, and I want it to make a promise that you'll have an onArticleSelected method. Well, that's fair. I'm just going to say when someone selects an item, I'm going to call my callback and say, hey, someone selected that item, and let somebody else worry about whether or not something needs to be done about it. So, if I go to my main activity, you'll see here that, sure enough, this activity implements that particular listener. It guarantees that there will be an onArticle selected. Now, that relationship has actually been established, I can have my headlines fragment just worry about what it does, regardless of if it's in a single pane or double pane view. Notice here, when I'm starting up, I do a little bit of a check to see whether or not I'm in a double pane view. If I am, I want to set the particular list mode choice to be single. I don't want to have it be something where multiple items are selected. But I don't have any reference to the fragment. I'm not passing in the fragment for article fragment in through some kind of constructor. I don't have a reference at all. What I'm doing is at this moment calling getFragmentManager, and then like findViewById, I'm finding the fragment by ID. You want to always get references to fragments inside of a method, and you always want to do it by using the fragment manager. The more that you cannot hold on to a fragment reference, the better you're going to be. You can't guarantee when those lifecycle moments are going to be called. It's alright to make something static to be reused, but really try to use the fragment manager to determine whether or not you are in a state of being in a dual pane, triple pane, 4 pane, however many fragments you want to use mode, versus wanting to flip through them on a smaller screen device. So let's look at actually how the activity flips these things around. There's 2 ways to go about doing it, and I've combined both of them here because I like to do it this way. It's not a particular way you have to do it, I just find it easier. you remember when we talked about that layout with the SW800DP? Again, this means use this layout directory in case the resolution is over 800. Well, I like to lay out my dual pane layouts this way, where I actually can use the fragment keyword and specify the package to the fragment to describe where it should be on the screen. This makes it super simple for a tablet layout to have a description in a way that makes sense that I can troubleshoot beforehand. And on top of that, I can also look at this for other views and have some semblance of an idea whether or not it's going to be using this layout, which is the smaller resolution layout, or the tablet layout. So, if you want to actually describe all of your particular layouts this way, and you can even see the rotation difference, here I have the proportions pretty much the same. You notice it's always 1 to 2. I have 1 and then 2/3. Okay, so that works out for a tablet. That seems pretty straightforward. We just kind of describe them as views themselves. Well, what about for the other case, the case for a particular phone, a small screen? This is where our activity is going to do some juggling for us. And it looks like a lot of code right away, only because I want to make sure that we step through this in a very clear fashion. So when we use this setContentView and describe r.layout.activityMain, this particular activity main XML is going to be used for a small screen, whereas this one is going to be used for the larger tablet size. Now that, to differentiate, I basically say if that container does not equal null, as in we have that particular container object in this particular version of ActivityMain, then I know that I need to manually add my fragment to it. So again, one is happening through XML automatically. Here we're going to be doing it programmatically. I'm just looking to make sure that if we restored from a previous state, not to start adding more fragments. And after that, I just create a new one. Headlines fragment equals new headlines fragment. The next step is on that particular fragment, I'm going to use something called setArguments to pass a bundle object around. Again, we don't have the intent system with fragments, but we can still pass around a bundle object with this setArguments method. The method call looks differently, but it's essentially the same. Sticking data in a bundle allows you to pass it around. Here I'm just getting the one that came from the intent that the activity was started with. Finally, you're going to see me using the getFragmentManager piece here with something that we like to call trainwreck code. It's where you have a dot and then method call and then dot and then method call. I don't really like people to use this, but for this particular type of call, it really makes things more readable. This method call that you see here, as you investigate it right now in the video, I'm going to show you actually what it could actually be represented as. You could say getFragmentManager returns a FragmentManager object, and I could say FragmentManager equals getFragmentManager. I could then use this method called beginTransaction and say, okay, what kind of object does that return? BeginTransaction returns a fragment transaction. Okay? Well, then I'll just make a fragment transaction equals this particular code. Now, as you can see, it's not really a train wreck, but we are creating a train. I'm now going to call the add method. Fragment transaction dot add gives us another fragment transaction. So rather than doing this and going back and forth, as you can see, it keeps returning the same types of pieces that makes this chain work. I'm actually almost issuing commands. You can kind of use it like this. Get the fragment manager and then issue these commands in this order. First, you want to begin a transaction, as in, I would like to add a fragment to the actual fragment management system. Here I am saying add the headlines fragment to the r.id.container. This is how you deal with fragments. You take them and you add them to a container. The fragment will then be in the view hierarchy just in the same way that any other view is. Finally, you need to say commit. Now remember, at this moment, you will not actually have that fragment on the screen. You've just put it in a queue, and the fragment management system of Android will put it on the screen at the time when it thinks it is most reasonable to. This is why you want to be very careful with having references to the fragment. Just assume that once you commit a fragment, it'll be handled on its own. Finally, let's look at the other cross-communication to the fragment. This onArticleSelected. It's the method that we signed up for when we said, hey, I'm going to implement the headlines fragment.onHeadlineSelectedListener. Well, this means when someone selects an article, like this code will run. Notice what I look for in my code is to capture, first of all, is that article fragment already there? In a two-pane layout, it's already running. So I try to get it by finding the fragment by ID. If we don't have one, then we know we're not in the two-pane mode, and we need to actually deal with that situation. Now, update article view, the communication from the activity up to the article fragment, is just a public method. We don't have to use any fancy callbacks. For a two-pane layout, we just need it to communicate what position element to actually use for data. However, in a one-pane layout, we need to swap the fragments, and this is how you swap them. Again, you get a new article fragment, the one that you want to actually swap it with. Again, what I was telling you about the particular setArguments method, here I am actually starting that one off with a particular integer that's going to refer to the position I want to show. And then again, finally here, we use our fragment manager, but it's a little bit different. We're beginning a transaction. We're using, instead of add, replace, to replace in that container that view with this fragment view. Finally, you're seeing a new thing here called add to backstack. You usually have to pass in a null here. It's a string that, honestly, I don't remember what it's supposed to be tagging for, but I've never actually used it. Next, we have an add to backstack command. This actually puts this particular fragment in a place where if somebody presses back, the swap and replace will then undo itself. This is what allows us to easily just swap a fragment a level in and then unroll that particular stack. And lastly, just like adding, we use commit. Now, if you keep all of your fragment management code in activity this way, and use interfaces in order to use callbacks down to the activity so that anything that gets selected here can actually percolate to this fragment through the activity, you won't have any headaches to create layouts this complex, not only for tablets, but for small phones.